Hello everyone, so if you go down to the bottom of my list of videos on my YouTube channel, you'll find two videos. One is a lyrics video from the Whitlams, and the other one is a clip of Stefan Molyneux talking about Rawls' social justice theory. And I don't make a response to it because it was made or uploaded before I, made responses to things on my channel. Instead, what I do, and this is what I did that caused many of my original videos to be produced, is I wrote down my response in the form of an essay. And this was probably the most coherent essay I ever wrote, and I did try several times reading it to produce it as a video. But what I generally found is that I'm not a big fan of just reading things off, especially when they're an essay. I can read them off if they're written slightly better. But the other thing is I have read much more on social justice theory since that video was made. And I guess I could talk about it quite a bit because I've read A Theory of Justice, which is about 600 pages long, and Justice as Fairness, a Restatement, which is about 200 pages long, so far too long. But I don't really want to, be too academic in a video featuring Stefan Molyneux. So first of all, I'm just going to explain what social justice theory is, or what I should say is I'm not really going to be talking about social justice theory exactly. I'm mostly just going to be talking about the thought experiment, because that's what Stefan Molyneux is talking about. The thought experiment is, and he words it, in his own way, but the way I like to think about it is imagine that, it's the world, and everyone is, is a rapture, and everyone is taken away from their bodies to heaven, sort of, and they're just conscious agents. And what we'll say is that Jesus comes out and he's about to begin his 1,000-year reign, unless you're an amillennialist or a post-millennialist, in which case he's not, but about to begin his 1,000-year reign. He says, even though this is completely out of character for me and theology in general, Christian theology in general, what we're going to do is we're going to decide by committee what rules I will implement when we both all go back down to earth. And even though I'm supernatural and everything, I'm not going to use any magic. I'm just going to help you to help yourselves. So you come up with whatever rules you want and I will enforce them, but they have to be rules compatible with our current society. And they're like, okay, we'll come up with those rules. And he says, but wait, when you go back down to earth and you get your consciousness again, you're not going to know who you're going to be. And as Rawls puts it, no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good, or their special psychological propensities. I completely buggered up that word. Propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. And that's how he puts it. So, imagine, if you will, that you're one of those people. What you would probably support, what Rawls reckons you'd support in that situation. And you have to think, this isn't just, being in the poorest 1% of Americans, or being in the poorest 1% of Westerners. This is a society where you have, a 50% chance-ish of being born in, absolute poverty. So, and you have a 1% chance of being born in a very wealthy situation. Now, what rules suggest is that pretty much everyone in that situation would say, okay, you know what I support? I support big taxes on the rich, high taxes on the rich, and massive redistribution to the rest of the world. Now the debaters, and one of the things that is important for the thought experiment is that the people who are coming up with this have an idea of economics and sociology and what will work and what won't work. So basically they're rational actors. So the debate you can have is redistribution the best way to solve the problem? But, this isn't necessarily about that. This is about establishing a moral basis for redistribution. And the moral basis is consensus. That no rational human being would say, would support, let's say, zero taxes, no redistribution, based on the 1% chance that they'd be a rich person, or compared to the 50% chance that they could be staggeringly poor. I'd say at least a 20% chance they would be basically at risk of dying from a disease or from hunger or something like that. No one would choose to have a laissez-faire flat tax system like that. But rules also suggest people are going to want to be able to advance themselves. So they're going to want to be free and have every advantage they can have in life, while at the same time not dying or failing to get anywhere in life because of the lack of distribution. And therefore, people will support redistributive wealth, or a system that brings about the same effects. People will support making life easier for the worst off at the expense of the already very easy lives of those who are best off. Now, Molyneux has a response to this, and his response is as follows.
So if I replace money with something else, like genitals, then we would say, what kind of society would we want in the distribution of sex? Well, you wouldn't want sex to always be coercive. Like, you wouldn't want rape to be the standard. Because if you were some super sexy man, then if you were Brad Pitt or whatever, then you could just go and have sex. No problem. Just go out and, you'd be able to have lots of women probably want to sleep with you and so on. So you wouldn't want sex to be coercive, because you could earn much more sex just simply by being attractive. Now, if you were really unattractive or unappealing, if you didn't like washing, if you were unpleasant or whatever, really bad breath or whatever, then you would still want to have access to sex. So you'd want a minimum of sex to be enforced by the state for everyone. In other words, a woman would be delivered to you, right? So on average, I think people have sex, if you're married, a couple of times a week kind of thing. If you're single, it's a little less. Let's just say it's twice a week. So you'd want a minimum of twice a week sex. You'd want the government to deliver women to you at gunpoint for sex twice a week, but you wouldn't want to be only limited to sex twice a week. You would then want to be able to go out and get more sex at a bar or whatever, but at a minimum, you would want twice a week to have sex, and the government to enforce that on your behalf, just in case you were ugly or unappealing or whatever. Now, this is a morally repulsive argument.
So first of all, Molyneux is approaching a thought experiment like a deontological ethicist. He's taking the conclusion and he's ignoring the argument. So the conclusion he's reached is, well, we should redistribute things. Because if you're really rich, then you don't need money, and if you're really poor, then you do need money. So he says, well, what if you really need sex? And that's his argument. But that's not the actual argument being made. The argument isn't this is the case, therefore we should do this. The argument isn't just because some people are rich and some people are poor, we should just redistribute it. The argument is, if people came up with rules for society not knowing whether or not they'd be rich or poor, then they would support these policies. So what we need to consider, and what Molyneux, if we're going to give any credit to Molyneux at all as a philosopher, we need to assume that he understands the argument, even though it seems unlikely he has. We need to assume that he sat there and thought, would people support a system of rape? Because what he's trying to argue is that there's an inconsistency, and he's trying to argue there's a deontological inconsistency. Because if it's right to do something here, why isn't it right to do something there? That's not what virtue ethics is about, and this is basically an argument based on virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is when you judge actions as moral according to the character and the intentions of the people who make those decisions. And in this case, you've got the character. The character is they're unbiased. The character is they don't know whether or not they'll be rich, whether or not they'll be poor. They're completely personally detached from the decision, which seems like a good character, a good state of mind to make moral decisions when you're not self-interested. And the intentions are they want to make the world the best it can possibly be for everyone. So that again seems like pretty good intentions. It seems as if the virtue argument is pretty solid, and you don't need to consider the deontology in the way that Stefan Molyneux has. Now, this isn't to say, you could make an argument that this thought experiment is completely detached from ethics, because it's not about, is the decision even moral? The first question you need to answer is, would people support redistributive justice? And that much seems obvious. I can't imagine anyone wouldn't, unless they have sort of a very strong deontological conviction against taxation. Now, the question that we need to ask is, would that same logic cause people to support rape? Because that's what Stefan Molyneux is proposing. And now that isn't to say that, we can completely detach morality from this, of course. This is to do with morality, but the main question we need to ask is this the case? Not necessarily ought this to be the case. But obviously, if it is the case that people would support rape, then we can probably say that we ought not to take the results of such a thought experiment seriously. Now, the first thing we should probably talk about is property. Stefan is conflating money, which is a means to attain property, transfer goods and services and labour, with women's genitals, which are attached to them. Also, slightly sexist, that he seems to be acting as if the women are the people to be thrown around. It's like the men want sex and the women are going to be distributed. You would have thought the argument should work the opposite way around. What if you're a really ugly woman? Are men going to be brought to you? But apparently not, because men aren't property. Women are much more comparable to money, it would seem. Now, the nuances of what is property and what isn't property is complicated, but it is precisely for this reason. The entire premise of Stefan Molyneux's argument is it makes absolutely no sense to divide property into different categories. And on there, he's just obviously wrong. There is a difference, a functional difference, between your actual human body and money. Money, which is a social construct, money, which is something that we made up in order to enable the transfer of goods. Those are two very different ideas. And this in and of itself doesn't provide a proof against his assertion, but it just indicates that the basis for his assertion is false. The basis being that he says that sexual organs and money are equivalent in every sense. Or at least in any moral sense when you can talk about them in terms of political philosophy. The other thing to consider is that there are differences in the prospective uses for money and sex, and one of the things that a lot of people like to forget is that liberal arguments like Rawls's and also socialist arguments are usually spearheaded by the pursuit of freedom. So in the case of liberals, they believe that you are more free if you have a society of order, and if you have a society where you can, do certain things, where you can get certain jobs, where you can achieve certain levels of education. They believe that makes you more free. And in that case, money is really important, because money has a lot of prospective uses. By giving people money, you are giving them the option to buy whatever goods and services they want, to invest in whatever they like. Money is, in effect, freedom, especially when contrasted with the restrictions of poverty. However, sex doesn't provide this. So, his argument could ultimately be applied to any commodity. He could just as easily have said, well, what if some people have more pizza than other people? Are we going to distribute pizza? Of course not, because distributing single-purpose commodities is not comparable to something with multitudinous uses, like money. Now, the other thing is that there is a big difference between money or taxation and between rape. And one of those is there's a loser in this distribution, clearly. In Rawls' social justice theory, the loser is a very wealthy man or woman, a very wealthy person with, billions of pounds. And maybe they'll be taxed 55%. 55% of all the money they have. Maybe 60%. Maybe 50%. But somewhere in the region of 55%, they'll be taxed. And that's them, the loser. The person with huge amounts of money loses 55% of it. And they have 45% left with which they can do whatever they want. Now, for most people, they wouldn't mind being that man. They wouldn't mind being the very rich person who loses 55% of their money. By contrast, there's no such thing, there's no spectrum between raped and not raped. There's no such thing as being 55% raped. This, of course, has moral significance, because to lose 55% of something that is morally desirable, in this case wealth, is quantifiably more moral than losing 100% of what is considered to be morally desirable, which would be not being raped. Now, Molyneux just clearly hasn't considered how offensive it is to compare an absolute transgression of bodily autonomy to a minor intrusion on personal wealth. Now, another thing, and this is something that always annoys me about libertarian arguments, is that they try and turn big social things into a one-on-one situation. And in this case, this is really obvious, You've got a man wants to have sex, a woman's going to be raped by him. In most of their situations, it's, is it okay to rob someone else to buy a sandwich for a poor person, to hold someone else at gunpoint? And it always sounds bad, because it always sounds unfair. One person's being stolen from, another person is gaining. But there is a collective responsibility here. It applies to the entire population based consistently on the same principles. That's what fairness is. Fairness is consistent principles for everyone. And that is what Rawls' social justice theory would bring about. Rawls' social justice theory would bring about consistent principles for everyone, because no one would know who they're going to be. They would want principles that would benefit them no matter who they were. Or rather, it would benefit them if they were in a really bad situation. It wouldn't hurt them too much if they were in a really good situation. Similarly, wealth distribution has wider sociological benefits. It's sex distribution makes no sense. Imagine how much money it would cost to traffic around sex victims or rape victims to everyone. It's a terrible idea. It's not a good way to run a society. By contrast, taxation much more logical way to move money about, much more logical way to move things about. Now, this is where we reach the conclusion that didn't really need to be concluded, which is that Molyneux hasn't actually used the logic of the argument he's addressing. Because the logic of the argument he's addressing would suggest that in that exact same scenario, the scenario I brought up earlier, everyone's taken to heaven. Jesus is like, hey, I'll give you some new rules. One of the rules, they would say, is, if I'm really ugly, I want you to take people to me and let me rape them. And then immediately afterwards, they've got to say the words, they've got to admit it. If I am born an attractive woman, I want to be raped. That is what Stefan Molyneux is suggesting people would say under social justice theory, by the same logic that they would say that they wouldn't mind wealth redistribution. The reality is that social justice theory actors would be prepared to make the sacrifice of wealth distribution. You can, I'm sure at some point we'll get the resources together, we'll do the poll of all 7 billion people. I guarantee at least 6 billion people, probably 6.5 billion people, maybe even only a rounding error of people not in opposition to this, the vast majority of people will say, of course, I would like to live in a system where, if I'm born really poor, I get some form of redistributive justice. If I'm born incredibly rich, or even if I make myself incredibly rich, I get a large amount of taxation to help other people, but I've still got all of that money left. That's a sacrifice people are willing to make. Now, this thought experiment in and of itself doesn't justify all of the principles that Rawls lays out. It just justifies some form of redistributive justice. And it does it quite well, because it ignores the problems of, tyranny of the majority, things like that, because people don't know who they're going to be. As an argument grounded in virtue ethics, as an argument grounded in the rationality of the people who are making the decisions and the impartiality of the people making the decisions, it is one of the best ethical arguments ever made in the history of political philosophy. And Molyneux completely fucked up his critique, so much so that I almost had fun just pointing out every single thing he got wrong. Now, because he failed to even consider the argument of what he was addressing, he didn't even, it's just insane how much he didn't get it right. And hopefully the flaws in this video, alongside flaws he made in the same video, which I will link to, Philosophy Lines made a video in response to this. I'm obviously only responding to 100 seconds, 1 minute and 40 seconds of Stefan Molyneux. Philosophy Lines responded to a few more seconds of what he said. And to be honest, if you went and watched the video yourself, I'm sure you could find a couple of seconds where you could spend about 20 minutes ranting about just how wrong it is, because that's just how wrong Stefan Molyneux is capable of being. And I'm sure by the time you watch that video, it will soundly put to rest any debate over whether or not Molyneux is justified in calling himself a philosopher. So thank you for watching. Bye.